Chapter 4. My brother is a brave man, but even the brave must know when to run away from danger. My brother is also smart. So the first time he fought the monster, he ran. It was the right thing to do. He is not stupid. Stupid men are not brave. They are simply dead. Corporal David Winford bounced the army Humvee through a shallow wash and up a rock slope, spinning the wheels in the dirt and the sand. He was following what would laughably be called a road, but in New Mexico anything less than four-wheel drive wouldn't have made it the first half mile. The sun beat down on his freckled skin. He had forgotten his hat back at the base. Possibly a serious mistake. He was a redhead, with a redhead's fair colouring, and just this brief exposure to the sun would turn him into a lobster. It had happened before. The back of the Humvee spun sideways before the tyres dug down to rock and lurched him forward. He gunned the engine just a little, giving the machine enough power to top a slight ridge. David was sweating as much from fighting the Humvee over the road as he was from the early morning sun. Even the wind rushing through his short hair didn't help cool him. And worst of all, he knew it was going to be for nothing. The colonel and the sarge were investigating a supposed bogey landing. They had taken half a dozen trucks and Humvees this morning when they left. They certainly didn't need another. It was just another stupid make-work job, and he hated it, and he hated the army. He spun the Humvee through another wash and had just started up the other side of the ravine when a figure burst over the top of the ridge, running at full speed. Now what the hell?" Winford said. He slammed on the brake and watched the guy barrel down the slope, leaping over rocks and brush like a hunted deer. The guy was wearing fatigues and looked familiar. The guy glanced over his shoulder once before skidding to a stop beside the vehicle. "Nakai?" Winford said, startled at the look on the man's sweat-covered face. "Aren't you supposed to be on tank duty today?" The question came out of surprise as much as anything else. No one ran away from his post, especially not Nakai. Nakai was always being hounded by the sarge and made up for it by following the rules to the letter. Winford respected Nakai for that. Most men would have given up entirely, including Winford. After all, if he were going to be yelled at for performing his job, he might as well screw off, right? At least, that's how the others would have thought. Nakai was another matter. Nakai took a deep, shuddering breath. Winford had never heard anyone's breathing sound so ragged before, and then managed to speak. "I'm on duty, but I won't go back up there." Winford's shoulders stiffened. Something was very wrong. "Why not, Corporal?" "You don't know what I saw." Nakai never really looked at Winford, but instead kept scanning the hillside above them, watching for something he obviously thought might be chasing him. Winford had seen that haunted look on green boys in boot camp when they realized they were in the service for the duration, but he had never seen it on a man who'd been in the army as long as Nakai. Winford had seen the pale version of that look on the faces of some of the COs, though, when they were reminiscing about Desert Storm. Winford unlatched the safety strap on his pistol and scanned the hillside when Nakai was staring. Nakai was making him nervous. There was nothing moving up there at all, just sand and scrub and rock, just exactly the same as everywhere else around here. "So what did you see?" Winford asked. Nakai stared into Winford's eyes for a moment, then looked back up the hill. "It's something I should report directly to the Sarge, or the Colonel." Something serious, then. Winford inclined his head towards the empty seat beside him. "Well then, hop aboard. I'm heading out to see him now." Nakai nodded and slowly climbed into the Humvee, all the time staying alert and focused on the hill he had come down. Winford looked again. He couldn't see anything. "Seems like you lost whatever it was." Nakai shook his head once, almost in dismissal. "It's not as simple as that." Seems straightforward to me, Winford said. Just drive. Nakai snapped. Winford glanced at him. Nakai's reaction had nothing to do with army protocol or the chain of command. It was cold and harsh, and beneath it, Winford thought he could hear a faint tone of fear. He ground the vehicle into motion, lurching up along the dirt road. Over the noise of the engine, he said, I'm sure the Sarge is going to want to know why you're not at your post. Corporal Nakai just stared out at the desert, looking for his unseen pursuer, not saying a word. If Nakai didn't care about the Sarge's reaction, then things had to be very bad. For the next few minutes they bounced down through an arroyo, then up the side, over more rock and dirt. Winford fought the Humvee forward over the rough ground, using the directions he'd been given at the base. Nakai sat quietly, holding on through the bumps, not even seeming to notice the roughness of the ride. Instead, his gaze darted from one rock to the next, one bush to the next, looking for God only knew what. Winford sure didn't, and Nakai clearly wasn't saying. Within 10 minutes they cleared the top of a high ridge near the base of a large mesa. The sight of the valley below damn near made Winford stomp on the brakes. The trucks that had left the base that morning before sunrise were in a circle surrounding something red and brown. The thing was round and large, but not so large that it couldn't be held by chains and lowered, with a crane, onto the back of a flatbed truck. Winford couldn't tell what the thing was, but it almost matched the New Mexico desert rock. What the? Nakai said, as he stood in the moving Humvee and started at the sight ahead, holding on to the top of the windshield to keep from getting tossed to the sand. At first, Winford couldn't figure out what he was looking at. Then, as he stopped the Humvee just above the circle of other vehicles, he understood. The red and brown something was an aircraft. A very strange-looking circular craft, not much bigger than a pickup truck. It had race car-like fins on one side and a cockpit area in the center. It was clearly a one-person machine, but there was no sign of the person who had flown it. Suddenly, from out of the group standing near the craft, the Sarge's voice boomed. Corporal Nakai! Just what the hell are you doing out here? Beside the Sarge, Colonel Atherley turned, frowning. Atherley was a slight, wiry man, with greying hair and a greying moustache. His skin was like leather, tanned by years of exposure to the elements. The thought made Winford touch his own face. It was hot. He was going to be badly burned. As if that mattered. The world had suddenly turned weird. Thank heaven for the Sarge's predictable behaviour. He was glaring at Nakai as he waited for an answer. Nakai, still standing in the Humvee, forced himself to look away from the strange craft. Then he snapped to attention and saluted. Both the Sarge and Colonel stepped towards the Humvee. Well, soldier, the Colonel said, somehow almost managing not to shout, you were asked a question. Sir, Corporal Nakai said, I must speak with you about a matter of extreme urgency. I'll say we have a matter of extreme urgency, the Sarge shouted at him as he stopped in front of the Humvee. Winford managed to keep his hands on the steering wheel and his eyes straight ahead, trying to be as invisible as he could be as the Sarge yelled at Nakai over him. The Sarge didn't give Nakai any time to answer. There's a foreign covert aircraft in our backyard, and you've abandoned your post. Winford had seen the Sarge angry before, but never like this. Nakai snapped off his salute, then climbed from the Humvee and stood at attention in front of the Sarge and the Colonel. Begging the Sergeant's pardon, he said, but I believe I may have encountered the occupant of that aircraft, and he's no spy, sir. What? The Colonel said, stepping forward and into the Corporal's face. Nakai didn't even flinch. I said, sir, that he's no spy. Winford froze. Nakai was running scared from the person who came in the craft. Winford almost turned toward Nakai, but to do that would be to call attention to himself, which, at this moment, was probably not a good thing to do. The colonel stared at Nakai for a long minute, never moving his gaze from Nakai's face. Then the colonel glanced at the Sarge and nodded. "Winford," the Sarge said, "leave the Humvee here and see what you can do to help load that craft onto the trucks." Winford climbed quickly out of the vehicle. "Yes, sir," he said, hoping he kept the disappointment out of his voice. Winford had been a small part of this drama, but no one felt he deserved to know what happened. That was one of the greatest frustrations of army life. He never got to know the full details about anything, and it seemed like this was something to know about. Winford turned and headed down the hill. It was clear to him that the Sarge and Colonel had ideas as to what the pilot of this craft might be, and it sounded as if Nakai's information contradicted theirs. A spy craft? A spacecraft? Could it be both? Winford shivered despite the growing heat. He glanced over his shoulder. No one was watching him. He lingered, hoping to hear what was going on. "Okay, son," the colonel said to Nakai. "Tell us what you saw." Nakai nodded once and spoke, but Winford was too far away to hear his answer.